Hey there, it's John from Heroes and Legends, and today is part 4 of our Dragons of Tarkir full set review, and we'll be looking at the red cards in the set. Tomorrow we'll finish up the colors with the green cards, which appropriately enough is St. Patrick's Day, and then the following day we'll hit the multicolor and colorless cards, and that'll get the whole set review completed by Wednesday, so a couple days ahead of the pre-release. So we got a lot of cards to look at. Let's get started. Our first card is Atarka Ifrit, and he's got some power behind him, but doesn't have much defense. So he's kind of a one and done creature for 4, which you're going to notice this is a theme with a lot of the red creatures is they don't have a whole lot of toughness, which is going to make them difficult to use, I think, in limited, at least many of them anyway. This one is probably a fine limited guy as long as you're using him more as a combat trick. You can cast him face down, and then for 3 you can flip him as a 6/2 creature, take out a creature, and that might be all he does. But in some decks, that's going to be good enough. Now, he's not going to make all limited decks just due to the fact he won't always make those profitable blocks for you. Atarka Pummeler, and this guy's a little better. He is a 4/5. He's got some toughness to him, so he's going to be a fine guy in limited. As far as formidable goes, it's a nice effect. It does allow for some evasion if you can get it off, but it is a little pricey. Obviously, he's a little too expensive and doesn't really do enough for constructed. Berserker's Onslaught. This is an expensive but powerful enchantment in limited. It's not going to fit into every deck, but if you have a lot of small creatures, this could be a win condition for you. Again, this is a card that you want to be careful with. You don't want to cast it ahead of time and put it out there to be destroyed. You want to play this card when you're ready to go in for the kill and use that double strike ability. This is also a very nice commander card and can buff up a big army like a tokens commander deck, for example. Again, it's going to be a little too expensive and conditional for constructed formats. With Lava, and I really like this card a lot. In limited, this is just a nice draw spell whenever you have mana. If it's early game, it's a couple cards. If it's late game, it could be more than that. Where this card really is going to shine, though, is constructed. I think any burn deck in any format in constructed would be happy to have a card like this. You get towards the mid to late game, you start running out of gas. This is a great way at the end of your opponent's turn to play this as an instant and just recoup all the cards and restock your hand and hopefully go in for the win and get enough burn. So really strong card. Crater Elemental, and this is actually a pretty decent limited creature. I like the fact that he comes out in turn 3 as a big blocker in 06. He buys you a little time. Mid game, if you run into trouble, he can destroy a creature, do 4 damage to target creature. That's pretty nice. And then late game, he becomes basically an 8/6 if you pay 3 mana. And that's a pretty big creature, even late game. And even though he doesn't have evasion, it's still kind of nice to have. And he's kind of with you through every step of the game, and he kind of does what you need him to do as you continue through a limited game. Obviously, not fast enough for constructed, but he's a decent limited creature. Descent of Dragons. So it's a little bit pricey. You do have to have creatures to target with this. Some aggro limited decks might be able to use this as a win condition, but that's probably going to be the exception to the rule. This card's going to look a lot better than it probably is going to play in limited. Where this card really shines is commander decks, such as tokens again. As far as constructed, unfortunately, it's a little too slow and unpredictable. Draconic Roar, and this is a Lightning Strike S card. Now, it can only target creatures, so it doesn't have quite the same versatility as Lightning Strike. However, if you have a dragon card in your hand or on the battlefield, it hits not only the creature, but hits the controller for 3 as well. So that's a pretty awesome limited card. It's going to do some work, and it's good enough, I think, to see some play in potentially a standard burn deck if one exists. Even if you don't have any dragons and it can just take out some creatures, it's decent. Now, obviously, if you have a dragon card in that deck or a couple copies of a dragon card, it would be much, much better. Dragon Fodder, and this card keeps coming back. It's going to give you a couple small creatures. As far as limited goes, it's a good exploit target, and it also can block an early morph, but that's about it. It kind of outlives its usefulness very quickly, so most limited decks are probably going to pass on this, I believe, in this format. Dragon Tempest is cheap enough to be useful if you have a lot of flyers or a lot of dragons in your limited deck. If you don't, you're probably going to pass on this. I mean, it is aggressively costed, so if you have the means to make it good, it's going to do work for you. It's going to shine more again in commander decks, such as dragon decks. I think it's a nice support card. Dragon Whisper, and now here's a really nice aggressive card. And in limited, this is a real cheap creature that can be given evasion and can be pumped up. This can get in and do some work. I really like it. It's also economical enough that I think it could see a place in an aggressive standard deck if there's a red or maybe a black and red aggressive deck that comes out of this set. I kind of wish it was a rare, not a mythic rare, because I just feel that if it becomes a constructed card, people are going to want maybe 4 of these, and that could really drive the price up too high. Dragon Lord Servant, and this is a nice cheap blocker, and it's got a nice perk in a dragon heavy limited deck. So it's not going to be great in all decks, but if you have a couple, 2, 3, maybe even 4 dragons, he's going to be worth putting in there just to get them out quicker and kind of jump that curve a little bit. And it's not like he doesn't do anything. He can block morph creatures and other small creatures, so that's a good thing. In Commander, this could be another good dragon support card. It's a decent limited card. It's not going to always make the cut because of the Dragons Matters piece of it. Hardened Berserker. And this guy's actually a good limited creature. He's a 3/2. He's probably not going to live very long. However, when he attacks, you get to cast your next spell for 1 mana less. And even if that's only one time, don't underestimate the importance of jumping that mana curve. It could put you ahead for the whole game just that one time. And if your opponent can't deal with this guy, you're really going to take a nice lead. I really like this card. He works in multiples as well, and he's at the common level. This can do a lot. Now, worst case scenario, he just simply goes out there and dies, but you can still get some value out of him. I do like this card a lot. Don't think he's pushed enough constructed because he will die quickly, and he'll probably die very quickly in constructed when your opponent has use of more removal spells. Impact Tremors, and this is another very aggressively priced enchantment. That just seems to be the theme of this block, is some very cheap enchantments that do a lot of work, and this is yet another one. This is going to be great in limited builds. And one thing I'll say is, notice it doesn't say non-token creature. So again, here's another commander card that would be awesome. It deals damage to all opponents, and play a deck like, say, Commander Tokens or something like that. This is actually pretty cool. So this is an exciting card. I think there's a lot of potential here. Now, a little slow for constructed, probably not going to get there in most formats, but fine limited card and fine commander card. Ire Shaman, and here's another pretty good limited card. Now, he's a smaller guy, he's a 2/1, but he does have a little bit of evasion, and he can megamorph pretty cheaply. And when he does megamorph, he basically draws you a card. So that's pretty cool. I could even see him being good enough to have some copies in a standard aggro deck if the metagame allows for that kind of deck. Kindled Fury. He's a cheap combat trick, decent support card in your limited deck. The only thing I will say, he's probably not always going to make your limited deck just because there's so much good removal to choose from that a combat trick removal might sometimes get outclassed. You may have just better options out there, but if you need a removal card, it's a very cheap removal card for red. Kolagon Aspirant, and not a whole lot here. I mean, it's a cheap creature, it's a 2/1, it's going to be okay in the limited game early on, and when it does get blocked, it deals an extra damage. The only thing is, if there are more 1 toughness creatures in the format, I'd say this guy might be okay, but there's really not that many. I mean, most of the time he's going to be going up against a morph creature, and he's just going to get sort of outclassed or trade with a morph. He's just too fragile to make the cut in a lot of limited builds, unfortunately. Kolagon Forerunners. Now, this is a better card. This is very aggressively costed, and for 3, you get a Trampler, and you can also dash him out for 3, which is just a nice little bonus, and his power is equal to the number of creatures you control. So if you don't have a creature-heavy deck, if you're playing more of a control-y limited deck, well, he's not going to be very good for you, but if you're playing your average limited deck, which is going to have a good amount of creatures in it, he's going to be great, and he's going to do some work. The only thing I would caution you is if you're in draft, don't try to build around this guy by picking up a lot of these mediocre, small red creatures, because you just can't count on A, drawing him at the right time, and B, if he's removed, now you just have a bunch of creatures on your hand that just can't do a whole lot. So, you don't want to build around this guy or build for this guy, but if he's in addition to what you already built up, he's going to be a fine guy. And obviously, he's going to be a little too situational for constructed. Polygon Stormsinger is a really fast card. He's got haste. He's a 1/1. He only costs 1. He can Megamorph for 1. And when he's turned up, he can give another creature haste. So he's good. The only thing in limited that I'm kind of concerned about is he's just another really fragile creature, and I don't know if he's going to last long. And I don't know if he can really do that much for you until the late game, where maybe he can give a big creature haste when he flips. But I don't know if that's enough, honestly, for most limited decks. Red just has a lot of these fragile creatures. So as far as limited goes, I don't know if he's always going to make the cut, or he may rarely make the cut. As far as aggro strategies and constructed, I just think there's better choices out there. He's good, and I could be wrong. He might be a powerhouse, and he just might be so fast, but I'm just not seeing it. I just think there's better creatures out there and better spells out there. Lightning Berserker, and here's a better version of the last card, I think. Costs 1 for a 1/1. Now, it doesn't have the haste. It does have a dash ability, which is nice, but you also have the fire breathing ability, so he can do a little more damage quicker. Again, he's very fragile. He's not going to last long, and you are going to get a little damage out of him, so he's nice to have maybe a one of or a couple of in a deck in the early part of the curve, but he's competing against some pretty good cards in Dragons of Tarkir, so he's not always going to make the cut, and I don't really think he's got what it takes to really cross over into Constructed either, even though he is a fast card. This is basically an act of treason with evasion. It does cost 1 more, but I like Act of Treason, and I didn't feel like it was as good in cons because there weren't as many sack outlets. I really like this type of card when you have a sack outlet where you can steal a creature, get in for some damage, and then sack it and get some sort of bonus from it. So it almost becomes removal with upside. And there are some options for that. I don't think we're going to see a ton of them, but I do like the fact that this creature does have a little bit of evasion. Magnetic Chasm. This is another very cheap sorcery card that's going to help you get past a board stall. The only thing I would say is the most powerful creatures in Dragons of Tarkir are all these dragons, and there's a lot of them. So the fact that it doesn't affect creatures with flying is a big flaw, and I don't really think this is going to do much for you, and I don't really see it making the cut in most limited decks. Qual Sisma Behemoth. Now, this is a much better creature. We're starting to get into kind of house territory here. He's a 3 for a 5/5. The drawback being he can't attack or block unless you pay 2. Blocking, I'm not concerned about. This guy should be attacking. You're paying 3 for him. He should be just going into the red zone and doing some work. And I don't mind paying the 2 mana to make that happen. So he's a good guy. I'm going to put him in my deck. There is a downside to him where sometimes you're compromising your board state a little bit to go in and do damage with him, but he's just so cheap, and he's a 5/5. I wouldn't be able to resist, especially when you look at your other choices in red creatures. There's just not a lot of strong choices out there, so he really shines as a much better limited guy. Rending Volley, and here's the red color hoser that we've been seeing in this block. These are just very aggressively priced. This one is awesome. So for 1 red, you get to do 4 damage at instant speed to a white or blue creature, and it can't be countered on top of that. That's incredible. So the only downside to this card is it is a color hoser. It may be starting out in your sideboard, but this card's good enough for limited. It's good enough for standard. It's good enough for modern. It may be good enough for legacy. This is a fine, fine sideboard card. Roast. And I like this. It's a very simple card. It's cheap removal for red. It deals 5 damage to target creature without flying. So now again, the downside is there's a lot of awesome flyers, so there are going to be times where Roast is stuck in your hand and you're getting beat down by dragons, and it's not going to feel good. But honestly, there's enough ground creatures that you're still going to put this in your limited deck, and you're going to feel pretty good about it. It's also cheap enough that it could possibly find its way into standard as a defensive card. Sabertooth Outrider. This guy only costs 4, but he's a 4/2. The trample's nice, but he's just not going to live long. Now, if you have the formidable ability, and you have power 8 or greater on the board, he gets first strike. Now he becomes a much, much, much better creature. So this is a guy that if I knew for sure I could put him down with a first strike, I'd play him in my limited deck. So I'm only putting him in decks where I know are going to be super creature heavy or maybe have a lot of big creatures in him. So then he's going to have some value. If I don't have that, he probably won't make my cut just because he's just not that good without first strike. Sarkhan's Rage. And this is a very good limited removal spell at instant speed. It's going to do 5 damage to a creature or player, which is nice because a lot of these other removal spells that we've seen don't give you the player option. And if you have no dragons, yeah, it's going to deal 2 to you, but that's not a big deal. Don't worry about that at all. This is good enough that it has some potential to maybe make it into standard. Now, it is a little pricey, though, at 5 mana, so that could keep it out. Sarkhan's Triumph. This is a fun card. This is a cheap dragon tutor. That's awesome. I just said the words dragon tutor. That's really cool. So, in limited, you're going to have some dragons. And this is a great way to get some of your stronger creatures into your hand. And it's at uncommon, so you could see multiple copies of these in a draft. I think they'll go pretty quick though, and they may encourage some people to splash for red. It's that good. This is also an awesome commander tutor in the dragon deck, and I was thinking about Constructed, and I honestly couldn't think of a home for this card, but never underestimate the power of tutors. Someone is going to figure out some crazy powerful dragon that, when it hits the board, warps the whole game, and they're going to use this to go find it. So you never know, but this is a really fun card. Scream Rage Brawler, and he's a 2/3. He's got dash. What I like about this guy in limited is he's actually got some toughness. He actually doesn't trade with a morph. Red just needs more of this, and I feel like that's Red's weakness in Dragons of Tarkir. So he's going to be a fine guy in limited. If you're playing Red, you're going to be happy to play him. He's going to feel even more valuable than he really is just because of the competition out there. But he's a good limited guy. Obviously, doesn't do enough for Constructed. Seismic Rupture and Pyroclasm effects are always good to have in limited as a panic button. Sometimes you start out in the sideboard and then you kind of feel out your opponent's deck and maybe bring it in, which is fine. The only drawback to this is it's not touching the flying creatures, and again, the flying creatures are the most dangerous ones. Now, 2 damage isn't going to kill a dragon anyway, but it would be nice if it could at least touch the flying creatures as well. Spreading Warbrute, and here's another stronger with higher toughness red creature, so he's going to be a very good limited card. Now he attacks each turn if able, and that's just fine. At 5/4 should be attacking every turn, especially if you're dashing him in for 4. And 5 is also a very nice price for limited for him. Now, too high for Constructed. He's not going to get you there in Constructed, but really good limited guy. Stormcrag Elemental, and similar to the last card, another good limited guy. He's a little pricey at 6. His Megamorph is a little harder to cast with 2 red and 4 colorless, but he's either a 5/5 or a 6/6 trample, and that's just going to be fine and limited. He's going to be a great guy. He's going to do work for you. Again, a little too pricey for Constructed. Stormwing Dragon. This is the 3rd card in a row. Kind of has the same theme. There's a whole cycle of these. You're going to pay 6 for a flying first strike 3/3 dragon. It's good enough and Constructed. The Megamorph is too expensive, and obviously the casting cost is too expensive for Constructed. But he's a fine guy. You'll get some use out of him in limited. Summit Prowler, and I kind of like this card's back from Cons. The art's a little different. Now there's dragons in the background. He was a good guy in Cons. He could do some work for you in Cons of Tarkir. I think he's even a better guy in this set because it's a little less multicolor centric, so it's probably going to be a little easier to cast a double red spell. So he's a great guy, and again, look at the competition out there. He's going to be a very welcome sight when you're drafting red. So very good. Obviously too pricey for any of the Constructed formats. This is excellent limited removal. It is a little dependent on the fact that you have to have a big enough creature for it to do its damage, but I like these cards. It's kind of like Fight, but you don't have to sacrifice your creature, or your creature doesn't have to take damage. You just simply do damage with it, and this is a really fine card. Now, the fact that it is conditional on what type of creatures you have will keep it out Constructed, but don't be afraid to play this in limited. It will do good work for you. Thunderbreak Regent, speaking of an awesome card in Limited, he's got an ability, but even if he didn't have that ability, I'll pay 4 for a 4/4 flying dragon all day long. That's aggressively costed. That's going to get in and do some work in Limited. And it's good enough to be the top end of an aggro deck curve and standard as well. So I really like this guy. And yeah, he's got the little bonus ability. If someone tries to target him, he's going to do 3 damage to them. That's cool, but I'm not even concerned about that. I just love the fact that he's a 4/4 flyer for 4. That's awesome. Tormenting Voice. Here's another card that's back from Dragons of Tarkir, and this card was interesting. I mean, it's good enough in Limited because it's going to let you draw a card and basically cycle for 2 mana. It's a sorcery. It'd be maybe a little better for as an instant. But even in cons, I found myself cutting this card a lot just because I found better spells to put in. It's not a bad spell at all. It's a nice little card draw spell, but it's not going to be good in every Limited deck. Red tends to be aggro, and usually you just rather have a creature and you end up cutting the Tormenting Voice. So it's going to be interesting to see if that's different in Dragons. I mean, maybe it will feel a little different considering the creatures might not be quite as good in red, but it's definitely a fine Limited card. Not going to do anything exciting in the constructed formats. Twin Bolts, good removal. It's going to be able to take out a morph, so that's good enough usually in Limited. If you have better removal, then maybe it doesn't make the cut, but this is a decent card. I'd probably play it in most situations. As far as Constructed goes, I think there's stronger burn spells out there. Even though this is a very cheap one, I don't know if it will make the leap to Constructed. Vandalize, very slow. It costs you 5. However, this is a really nice limited sideboard card when you know you got to deal with an artifact and or a land. There's a lot of, and I don't know, Dragons may be different than we saw in Cons, Fate Reforged. Cons had a lot of fragile mana bases because a lot of folks were trying to splash and get these really splashy multicolored creatures out there. Some people may try to do the same thing for Dragons and Dragons of Tarkir, so this card might actually just become better because if somebody is trying to splash to get some great, big house or maybe a couple dragons out, this could really disrupt their game. So I really like this as a sideboard card. Obviously too pricey for Constructed. Volcanic Rush. Attacking creatures get this bonus and they get trample. Now it costs 5, but you can do it at instant speed. So this is a very nice combat trick, but it's only going to really work if you have a lot of small creatures. Now red does have a lot of small creatures, and this is at common level, so you could get a couple of these in your deck. So it could be good enough. Now, you need to know your deck. Obviously, if you don't have enough creatures for this to be profitable at that cost, you don't want to touch it. And as far as Constructed goes, obviously, it's probably going to be much too expensive for the aggro decks there. Volcanic Vision. This is a really interesting card. Is almost like, well, could be a board sweep potentially, as long as you have a instant or sorcery card that's strong enough in your graveyard. It can get you back an instant or sorcery spell. So in Limited, sometimes just pulling a dragon tutor back and being able to get a dragon is good enough, and it also will wipe out your opponent's small creatures. That does work. Now it costs 7, but that's doing a lot for 7. So I do like that. Now, if you don't have good instant or sorceries, or I should say, at least some mid-game to late-game instant and sorceries that you can go in your graveyard, this card becomes a little worse. So it's not going to make the cut in all red limited decks, but it just has so much potential to do so much damage and really wipe your opponent's board that you may want to play to kind of set that up if possible. The only feel bad about this card is you don't want to put 2 or 3 really expensive sorceries or instants in your deck along with this, and then you draw them all when you're starting a game out and you have to mull again, So you are sacrificing maybe your curve a little bit to try to get this to work, and that's a dangerous thing. But at the same time, when it works, wow, it's gonna win you the game. So you just have to balance that and just be very thoughtful about when you do give this card the nod and put it in your deck. As far as Commander goes, this is crazy for Commander. So imagine, you have this expensive, flashy instant or sorcery. I mean, there's things out there like Omnipotence and just really expensive stuff that you just get in your graveyard, and then you play this and you just basically wipe all your opponent's creatures off the board. I mean, you can do some crazy things with this in Commander. So, very interesting card. I'm going to be excited to see what this ends up doing in the future. I think it's a little too costly for constructed, but it just has such a big effect. Warbringer, and here's another kind of Dash Lord that's almost begging to be drafted and nudge you into a dash draft strategy. So he's a great creature. I mean, he's a hill giant, 4 for a 3/3, which is a just fine body size in limited. And then on top of that, he takes 2 off any dash cost, and he has dash for 3. So he just does so much. I love this card. The only downside to this really in limited is you just want to be careful in a draft because he is uncommon, so there could be a few of him floating around, and it may encourage other people to start drafting all the dash cards as well. So you could be drafting dash, everything's going great, and then all of a sudden it dries up. You do have to be careful and be mindful of that. But I really like this card. I think it's going to be a fun limited card. Zergo Bellstriker, and he's our last card for the day. And I'll start off by saying I love the flavor. I love the fact that he went from this huge creature in Dragons of Tarkir down to a 2/2, which is kind of funny. But at the same time, he may actually be better in this form as a 2/2 than his previous form where he was much more expensive. For 1 red, you're getting a 2/2 creature. That's awesome. Yeah, he can't block creatures of power 2 or greater, but who cares? He really shouldn't be blocking anyway, and he has a dash ability on top of it. So he not only is he a great limited guy, but he could also make his way into a standard aggro build. His only drawback is he is legendary, so that could hurt you when it comes to constructed formats. You might not want 4 copies just in case you draw heavy on him. So a little bit of a drawback, but he's a definitely good guy. And having said that, those are all the red cards for Dragons of Tarkir. So tomorrow we'll finish up the color wheel with the green, and then on Wednesday we'll be back one last time to look at all the multicolor and colorless cards in the sets. Please remember to like and subscribe, catch those last couple episodes, and as always, have a great day.